This video is brought to you by McCall's Quilting and by Troy Riverwoods Collection.
Hi, I'm Laura Roberts, and today I'm going to be showing you how to stitch and press opposing seams. This is the block we're going to be working with today. It's called the framed water wheel, and you'll see instructions for it in the February issue of McCall's Quilting magazine, February 2013. And what I'm going to be talking to you about is planning your pressing, because if your seams aren't opposing, meaning if they're not pressed in opposite directions where they meet, you get that great big lump, and sometimes it can't be helped. But you always want to plan your pressing if you possibly can. The first thing you want to do when you're planning your pressing is decide, take a look. This is my darkest fabric. So when I'm pressing, I always want to press to the dark fabric unless there's a reason that I shouldn't, unless there's a reason not to, and I will tell you about that later. So when I'm planning my pressing, I know that on this unit, my half square triangle or piece square, I'll be pressing toward the dark. I'm going to be pressing toward the dark here and here and anywhere I can. And then the other thing to consider is this center is not a pieced square. That's just a plain fabric. So that means there aren't any seam allowances already in here when I go to sew these things on. So what I will be doing is pressing into that center square as much as possible. Now, when I'm out here, this seam and this little seam, I want them going in opposite directions. And I'm going to plan that ahead knowing that I need to do that. So I'm going to show you how that works. I'm going to show you what happened on the back. Okay, if you look at the back of the block, you'll see that these seams are pressed to the dark side, right there, and there, and there. And here I have these seams coming into the middle, and this seam allowance coming into the middle. And then if you look way over here on this edge, you'll see that this seam comes like this, and this little seam went like that. And pressing in opposite directions like that, anywhere two pieces meet, will make your block lie flatter, and it makes it an easier way to get your points to match. So I'm going to start with the first unit. The first unit of this block that I'm going to show you is the 4-patch up here. And it's a very common unit. I'm sure you use it a lot of the time in your blocks. I know I do. So here's the strip set that I already sewed together. I've got my dark and here's my light. And the way to press to the dark side is to put it so the dark side is up. And then I'm just going to open this up like this and push that, press that over. So here's my iron, and I'm just going to gently press that seam onto the dark side like that. There we go. All right. So there's my strip set, and as you can see, that seam allowance is pressed under the dark. So what I would do is, of course, I would be cutting segments from my strip set, and here are my two little pieces. Now, because the seam allowance is pressed to the dark side on both of those, when I turn one to make that 4-patch, I'm going to have seams that are opposing. And what that means is that the seam allowance is going to come together like this. Right on the edge, when you sew them together and you get those aligned, you can feel it. You kind of work it and you can feel when they're just nested into one another. Do you see that? All right, so I'm going to nest these together, both sides, and I'm going to sew them together, holding that little nesting piece, knowing that that's right, making sure everything else is aligned. Well, it's just right. And when you sew with opposing seams like this, you always want to have this seam allowance pointing away from you when you go into the machine. That way when it comes into the machine, you can make sure that it doesn't get pushed the wrong way. You can keep it like that. And you're pushing, because of the way these are lined up, you're pushing this piece right into that point where they match. That's going to give you nice points, nice match points when you sew your units together. So I'm just going to get this on the machine now. Okay. This is my little thread tail, so I don't get the thread stuck down the fabric going down into the throat plate. Okay, now here I'm going to just hold that, making sure as I sew along. Here we go. Make sure that stays going its direction. Okay, that looks good. Now down here I'm going to line these up just like that and sew on down. Now, of course, my seams are a little straighter when I'm sewing at home, so just ignore that part. Okay, I'm going to take that out of the machine and cut my threads. There we go, like that. Now when I open it up, whoops, there you go. See how perfectly those match? Look at that, perfect point. As far as pressing this piece, it doesn't really matter because it's not like there's a real light or dark because it has both. So I'm just going to press it one way, like that. Okay, there we go. And I've got my 4-patch now ready to go into the block. Now my next unit is this half square triangle or piece square. And the way I did that, I took my lighter fabric, I drew a diagonal line along there, stitched on either side, and now cut it in half. And I have pieces like that. Again, to get that seam allowance under the dark fabric, I put the dark fabric on top, like that. And I'm just going to press right on through, like that. So, if you look at the other side, these are both pressed. See, the seam allowances are under the darker fabric. The reason we do that is if on these fabrics it doesn't matter so much, but if this were white and this were navy blue, you'd be able to see the navy blue in the seam allowance coming through the white. And so that's why we always press to the dark side. So here are the rows I've already sewn. Now this I just sewed my piece squares to the center square and pressed it into the middle as I discussed earlier. Now, since those are pressed into the middle, I know that the next one down I need to press going out so that those opposing seams will be there and we'll be able to lock. So that's what this is. And if we turn it over, you can see that I have these seam allowances going out, these seam allowances going in, so you know that they're going to nest. Okay, there we go. And then here are the ones that I just made. I'm just going to lay those out here, looking all pretty. Isn't this a beautiful block? I love this block. Okay, there. That's right. So here's the block, and when I sew this seam and this seam, because that's going in, again, I'm going to sew those to go out. Now on this block, I have side strips here and here. Now they're lighter. So normally I would be pressing away from the light and under the dark. But along this edge, there are lots of seam allowances. Well, if I press that like the other way, if I pressed it this way, I would be doubling that thickness. And it's more important to have that block lying flat. So what I'm going to do is press this to the light. Now, because I'm pressing these to the light, on the top and bottom strips, I need to be pressing to the dark. Here's a tip. Always press from the right side of your piecing. Don't press from the side where you can see the seam. It's always going to lay flatter and it just opens it better. So you don't have a lot of fabric caught in that seam allowance if you press from the right side. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put the iron on that dark piece, and that will push that seam allowance to the light side. I'm just going to iron right across there, press right across there. So this is now going to the light and to the light, and I have, of course, this one down here, which would also be pressed to the light. I put all these together, okay, just like this. And when they're all sewn together, you have this block, and you see how flat that is? Do you see how? And it was so much easier to sew. And my points get right where I want them. See how the points are right where I want them to be because they were pushed in and nested. So I hope you had fun with this today. Opposing seams really do make your life easier, and they are going to make your blocks look flatter and make your points tighter.
This video is brought to you by McCall's Quilting and by Troy River Woods Collection.